Alright, so let's talk about Kenjogo, or humble language in Japanese. This is the companion piece to the Sonkeigo video I made earlier, and one of 3 videos where I'll be talking about honorifics. Just to begin in the same way, a few caveats before we start. First and foremost, TikTok's not the best place for like a large form detailed lecture, so this is going to be kind of a crash course designed to demystify rather than go over every single vocabulary word you'll need. On top of that, don't forget that there is no such thing as absolutely polite language use. Using Kenjogo obviously can be polite, but in some cases is just formulaic or what's expected. I got an interesting comment on an earlier video being like, if someone at a store or restaurant uses Sonkeigo to me, can I use Sonkeigo back? And you might think, oh yeah, let's be respectful to each other. But in that situation, no, you can't, because rather than being polite, what the person is really doing there is notifying the relationship between the two of you, the power relationship. And anyone who's worked in any restaurant or any retail knows very well that oftentimes using polite language is something you do when what you're actually feeling is incredible frustration at the customer. Still, you use it because that's kind of how the relationship is. And it's more what is expected than what is polite. Likewise, if you were to use these forms when talking with friends or in more casual situations, it would sound quite strange and likely more distant than polite. Finally, one key feature of Kenjogo that doesn't really happen with Sonkeigo is that you should only use these quote-unquote humble forms when the act that you did has some relationship to or benefit to the person that you're talking to. So for instance, if your boss says, hey, I need you to go to Hawaii for a business trip, you could say, I will go to Hawaii using Kenjogo forms. But if your boss is like, hey, what are you going to do on your vacation? And you go, I'm going to go to Hawaii. You would not use Kenjogo. You would just use Desmos form, and that's good to go. Don't use humble forms. The act that you're doing has no relationship to who you're talking to. So the basics of Kenjogo. With Sonkeigo, if you remember, there were 3 patterns. With Kenjogo, there are only 2. The first is, again, just take the word that you would normally say and say a different word instead. I don't have time to go over every single example of this. Again, I do have a textbook for you on my website if you want to check it out, but let's just do some key examples. Mairu is a very useful Kenjogo that can be used for iku and kuru. So if you were going to say, I will go somewhere tomorrow, and again, this is an act that benefits the person you're talking to in some way, such as going somewhere for work and you're talking to your boss, watashi wa mairimasu would replace watashi wa ikimasu. And that's basically it. Just, again, say one thing instead of another. As just another quick example, zonjiru, which is a ru verb, can be used to mean both know and think. So if you want to say, I think that's true, you could say, so dato zonjimasu instead of so dato omoimasu. One of these I need to talk about specifically is sashiageru, which is the humble form of ageru, or to give. Now, it's fine to use this to mean to actually give something. If you're talking to a coworker about a gift you gave to a customer, you could say, kyakusama ni sashiagemashita, and that'd be fine. However, in the te ageru form, so the form you use when you do a verb for someone else's benefit, if you're familiar with that, te sashiageru is technically correct, but a lot of people advise you to never use that whatsoever because there's no way to really humbly do something for someone else. It sounds kind of weird. So if you say like, tsukutte sashiagemashita, it can sound pretentious or strange. In these cases, it's better just to avoid this verb entirely and just say something like, I made it, using Kenjogo for the verb. So what are the Kenjogo forms? Well, the second pattern that you can do is just like with Sonkeigo, a conjugation form. And this is, again, just like Sonkeigo, one that you're not supposed to do to most of the verbs that have a replacement verb that you saw earlier. So yes, a lot of what we're doing is going to mirror Sonkeigo, including how we do this pattern, because we're going to start by taking the verb and putting it in its stem, which is the mas form minus mas. I mentioned tsukuru earlier, so let's use that. Tsukurimasu becomes tsukuri. Then attach o in the front, again, exact same, otsukuri. And then instead of adding ni naru though, you're going to add suru, so otsukuri suru. So I made it, again, in a way that benefits the person I'm talking to in some way, otsukuri shimasu. Again though, you can't do this with most verbs that have a replacement pattern. So with iku, again, for instance, the replacement is mairu. Because that replacement exists, you cannot say oiki suru or oiki shimasu to mean I will go. It's strange. That said, there are a few verbs where actually both forms are okay. So for instance, ao does have the replacement verb omei ni kakaru. So omei ni kakatte tottemo ureshii desu is a fine way of saying I'm so happy I met you. But oai dekite ureshii desu is absolutely fine as well. And the fact that these verbs kind of allow this use of either pattern is something you just kind of have to accept. And that's basically it. Either change the verb, or if you can't, use the pattern. Although I should note that ukagao is sometimes changed to o ukagai suru, and that is again technically wrong, but An error that is made so commonly that it's somewhat becoming normalized and accepted. However, if you want to be really, really strict and impress people by doing your keigo really, really well, when you want to say ask, just use ukagaimasu without mixing the patterns together. Beyond the massive error of using kenjogo to refer to the actions of someone who's not in your in-group, which is something that does happen, there aren't that many mistakes that you can make. For instance, hopefully you remember niju keigo from the last video, where you apply the simple keigo patterns to the same verb, resulting in something that is technically incorrect. With kenjogo, you actually kind of can't do that. So, for instance, the kenjogo for suru is itasu, and the kenjogo for tsukuru, as you remember earlier, is otsukuri suru. So you might think that otsukuri itasu, or otsukuri itashimasu, is double keigo, but it's actually not. And the reason is that it's not. And you just have to kind of accept that. Now, there is a reason. The Japanese government has actually recently rebroken down how they split polite terms up, and they've broken keigo into two categories. And in this new categorization system, the o and the suru in kenjogo are treated as different patterns, whereas the o ninaru in sonkeigo are not. But this is just people finding explanations for facts. And the fact is, you can do it. It's okay. It's still not okay to do this with the replacement pattern, like omairi suru is out. With the replacement pattern, just replace the verb and then you are done. But it is okay to do things like okaki itashimasu or otsukuri itashimasu. So that's the second crash course on honorifics in Japanese. I hope that made things a little bit clearer. And there'll be one final video on just generic ways to pretty up or polite up your language whenever I have the time to otsukuri shimasu.